The train hissed like a dying beast as it pulled into the small, wind-beaten station of Red Hollow, steam curling into the cold Wyoming dawn. And Caleb Turner stood alone at the edge of the platform with his hat pulled low and grief stitched into every line of his face. A widowed cowboy who had buried his wife just 6 months earlier and buried his heart with her. A man who had known love once and lost it to fever that swept through the prairie like judgment, leaving him with nothing but a quiet ranch, a restless night sky, and silence so loud it rang in his ears. He hadn't come to the station expecting anything more than a shipment of fence wire and a sack of seed. But fate has a cruel and curious way of changing a man, his path in a single breath. And that breath came in the form of a woman in a torn ivory wedding dress, who stumbled off the last passenger car like she had outrun the devil himself. Her veil missing, her hair undone, fear blazing in her eyes as 2 well-dressed men jumped down after her, shouting her name, "Clara!" with authority that sounded more like ownership than concern. Caleb watched the way she spun in a circle, desperate, trapped between the train and the open land, and something old and protective stirred in his chest, something he thought had died with his wife, because he recognized that look in her eyes, the look of someone cornered with no one coming to save them. And before he had fully decided, before logic could catch up with instinct, he stepped forward and placed himself between her and the men, his broad shoulders forming a wall as solid as the mountains behind them. And when the taller man demanded he step aside because the woman was promised to a wealthy rancher 3 counties east, Caleb's voice came out calm but edged with steel as he said she didn't look promised. She looked hunted. Clara's fingers trembled as they clutched the back of his coat, and in that fragile touch he felt the weight of a choice that would change everything. Because Red Hollow was a town that thrived on gossip and hierarchy, and defying a powerful rancher's claim could cost a man more than pride. It could cost land, cattle, even blood. But when Caleb looked down at her and saw a bruise darkening along her wrist beneath lace, the decision was no longer difficult, it was necessary. So he did the only thing that could stop the men without drawing his revolver in front of half the town. He wrapped an arm around Clara's shoulders and announced, clear enough for every ear on the platform to hear, that she was his wife and had been since dawn, that any man claiming otherwise would have to bring proof stronger than a wedding contract signed under pressure. The lie fell into the air, heavy and dangerous, and Clara's gasp was nearly silent. But she understood, and when the station master asked for confirmation, she lifted her chin with trembling courage and said yes, her voice thin but steady enough to shift the balance of power in that moment. The 2 men hesitated, calculating scandal versus force, and in that hesitation Caleb saw victory, because dragging a married woman back to her groom would cause more trouble than it solved. So they spat threats about unfinished business and rode off in a cloud of dust that promised they would return. And just like that, Caleb Turner found himself walking beside a stranger who now legally and publicly bore his name. They didn't speak until they reached the edge of town, where the open plains stretched wide and honest. And Clara finally asked why he would risk everything for someone he didn't know. And Caleb answered with truth he hadn't spoken aloud since his wife passed, that he knew what it was to be powerless against fate, and he wouldn't stand by while fate crushed someone else. If he had the strength to intervene, Clara told him she had been forced into the marriage to settle her father's debts, that the groom saw her as payment rather than partner, that she ran the morning of the ceremony with nothing but the dress she wore and a ticket bought with coins she had hidden for months. And as they rode toward Caleb's ranch, a quiet understanding formed between them, not of romance, but of refuge, an agreement forged by necessity and respect. Yet the town would talk, and the powerful rancher would not surrender his claim easily, and danger would come riding sooner than either of them wished. Still, as the sun climbed higher and lit the prairie gold, Caleb felt something unfamiliar warming his chest. Not love, not yet, but purpose. And sometimes purpose is the first step back toward a heart that has forgotten how to beat for more than survival. And Clara, sitting behind him on the saddle, gripping tight, not in fear but in trust, felt the first breath of safety she had known in years. But safety in the West is fragile, and the storm gathering on the horizon was not made of clouds, but of men with money, pride, and guns. And if you want to know whether a lie born of protection can... By the time the first rider appeared on the ridge 3 days later, Caleb had already known trouble was coming. Because men like Victor Langston, the wealthy rancher Clara had fled, did not accept humiliation quietly. And sure enough, the dust cloud carried more than one horse. It carried a message written in arrogance and sharpened by wounded pride. Clara had begun settling into the rhythm of ranch life, trading silk for denim, learning the quiet language of cattle and windmills, discovering that Caleb spoke little but listened deeply. And in the evenings, they shared coffee on the porch beneath a sky blazing with stars, speaking of the past in fragments that slowly stitched together trust. Yet neither dared speak of the future because their marriage had begun as a shield, not a vow born of love. But danger has a way of clarifying hearts, and when Langston's men rode up demanding Clara return to fulfill her contract, Caleb stepped forward not as a man hiding behind a lie, but as a husband standing in truth. Because somewhere between mending fences and sharing laughter over burnt biscuits, the lie had shifted into something real. Langston himself arrived the following morning in a polished black coat that looked absurd against prairie dust, offering Caleb money, more than the ranch was worth, to annul the marriage quietly. But Clara's hand found Caleb's before he could answer. And in that simple touch he understood that she was no longer running. She was choosing. And he refused the offer with calm defiance that made Langston's jaw tighten. Threats followed, subtle at first. Cattle spooked in the night. Fence posts cut. A barn set ablaze under moonlight. But Caleb had faced loss before and would not bow now. And when Clara insisted she would not be the reason he lost everything, he told her she was the reason he remembered how to fight for something again. The town, once skeptical, began to shift as they saw Clara working alongside Caleb, tending to sick calves, bringing pies to neighbors, standing tall when whispers tried to shame her. And slowly Red Hollow chose sides, because the West respects grit more than gold. The final confrontation came at the edge of Caleb's property, where the plains dipped toward a dry creek bed. Langston arriving with hired guns, intent on dragging Clara away by force. But Caleb stood firm, rifle steady, and declared before witnesses from town that Clara was his lawful wife, and that any man crossing that line would answer not only to him, but to every neighbor who believed a woman was not property to be traded. And in a moment that felt suspended between heartbeat and gunfire, Clara stepped forward herself and told Langston she would rather live poor and honest than rich and owned, her voice ringing across the prairie like a bell of reckoning. And something in the gathered crowd shifted from tension to solidarity as townsmen moved to stand beside Caleb. Because tyranny thrives in isolation but dies in unity. Outnumbered and publicly challenged, Langston realized force would cost him reputation and possibly blood, and with a curse he turned his horse away, vowing legal retaliation that never truly came. Because even powerful men fear communities that have chosen courage. When the dust settled and the riders disappeared beyond the ridge, Caleb lowered his rifle and looked at Clara not as a responsibility, but as a partner. And for the first time since his wife's passing, he allowed himself to imagine a future that did not feel like betrayal of the past, but continuation of the love he had once known, transformed and renewed. And beneath the vast western sky, he took Clara in his hands and told her that while their marriage had begun as protection, he wanted it now as promise, freely chosen. And she answered not with fear, but with a smile that carried sunrise in it. Months later, the ranch thrived stronger than before, laughter echoing through halls once haunted by silence. And Caleb understood that grief had not been erased, but softened by shared strength. That love does not replace what was lost, but grows beside it. And Clara, once a runaway bride, became the fiercest defender of the home she had nearly never found, proving that sometimes destiny arrives not in grand romance, but in a desperate moment on a train platform where one brave decision changes two lives forever. And if this story of courage, second chances, and a marriage born from protection but strengthened by love moved your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful Wild West stories where honor rides tall. Love defies fear, and every ending is earned beneath an endless frontier sky.